At 2:37 a.m., when the ranch dogs had already curled back into sleep and the Montana wind had a voice only the pines remembered, a light came down like an answer. It did not fall so much as settle, soft, not harsh, not blinding, but precise, as if someone had tuned a radio until the static thinned and a single clear note emerged. Joseph Walker felt it first behind his sternum, a pressure like a hand asking politely for attention. He stood on the sagging porch, one hand on the rail, and watched the far meadow change color. The moon was there, cold and indifferent, but this light had texture, a warmth that tasted faintly of iron and of something else he could not name, and under it the air hummed like a hive. He would later tell people the time, because times matter to those who are listening for signs. He would say he had been awake for hours, unable to sleep since Martha had been gone, thinking of the way she folded her hands at night, and of the kettle that always sang earlier than it needed to. He would say he wanted nothing grand, no epiphany, no sudden relief, only a rest in which his lungs stopped remembering how to ache. What arrived was neither angel nor enemy, neither thunder nor lecture. It was an intelligence without face in the way he expected a face. It spoke inside his head before a mouth formed, clear, gentle, like a river telling you its direction. The being said in Joseph's mind, "I came to show you what Jesus actually did and why they hid it." Joseph dropped the mug he had been holding. It did not shatter. The light shifted, and he felt the words not as sound, but as an explanation pressed into the bones of his chest. He tasted salt, Martha's handkerchief salt, and for a moment grief and curiosity braided together into something like courage. He was 67, a man who had tilled the same quarter section for 40 years, who had kissed his wife goodbye by the garden gate and watched illness take the slow shape of a winter he could not block with coats. He had been to church in his youth because faith was a family thing, one of the routines that kept the seasons honest. After Martha died 2 years before, his habit of going stopped not with anger at God, but with a fatigue that felt sharper than the cold. Out here, at the edge of what he had known for decades, the world was offering him a contradiction, a presence that claimed to explain the most intimate story he had ever lived. Joseph had been raised to believe miracles were gestures of God's sovereign will, unique, unrepeatable, reserved for prophets and saints. The being's words unsettled that ledger. What if those feats had been demonstrations of something human, something measured by openness rather than heritage? The very idea made his scalp prickle. He had been skeptical enough to make peace with doubt. He had been longing enough to hate that peace. If you want the full guide mentioned in this story, check the pinned comment below.
The thing before him did not resemble the metal-robed visitors of sensational stories. No pronounced limbs, no oversized eyes fixed in parody. It was an arrangement of light and negative space, a presence more like a pattern. At times, through it, Joseph thought he glimpsed geometry, circles folding into other circles, lines of faint color tracing paths he could not follow with his eyes. And behind the pattern was attention, an attention that could look and name. The attention probed not with force but with curiosity. The field around it moved like water rustling around a stone. Everything shifted, but nothing broke. The being did not argue. It offered a frame. The first thing it offered was an insistence on language. That miracle had been a word slapped onto a performance without accounting for method. The being said in Joseph's mind, he did not act apart from human possibility. He amplified a frequency that dissolves what divides, and when enough people tuned to it, what we call the impossible yielded. This was not a lecture, and it was not meant to demolish belief. Joseph could feel the being choosing words that would not bruise the parts of him still holding to prayer. The claim felt deceptively simple, that Jesus' work was a living demonstration of a state, a persistent humanizing energy centered in what the being called the heart. The being called it a frequency because words like state and field were clumsy across minds that had never agreed on the same meanings. Frequency suggested something measurable, repeatable, a pattern rather than a miracle in the sense Joseph had always been taught. "You talk as if you can prove it," Joseph said aloud. His voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, hollow as if the porch and the field were holding it in their mouths. The being did not need him to speak. It had all the words it required. It answered anyway, inside him, with a softness that knew the shape of someone who had wept for a wife. The being said in Joseph's mind, "Proof is not what I offer. I offer a demonstration and an invitation. I do not stand in judgment of the stories you keep. I stand only with a practice that opens a particular organ of being, your heart, to its native frequency. That the explanation came from a presence Joseph could not name made the thought more scandalous to his training, and at the same time less risky. If truth came disguised in a non-human mouth, belief would not be threatened. It could choose. And here was the second part of the confession, the part that would later make him cough and laugh and fall to his knees in bewildered blessing. The being claimed that history had hidden the method, intentionally in some ways, accidentally across centuries in others, because institutions prefer codified doctrine to living technique. The being said in Joseph's mind, institutions convert demonstration into doctrine because doctrine is easier to guard.
Practices that require ongoing individual reactivation invite unpredictability. They empower people rather than hierarchies. In the story you know, practices became prayer books, and experience became something to be explained away. The phrasing, "in the story you know," was a measured admission. The being did not say the church had done evil. It suggested a natural drift. Practices that healed in the streets required bodies, and bodies change. As communities grew, survival favored structures that taught and regulated. Over generations, the living technique, the daily work of cultivating a frequency of love, was reframed as a set of beliefs to be affirmed and positions to be inherited. Joseph, who had cut and stored hay with his father, and who had learned scripture in a Sunday school colder than this porch, wrestled with the image. His training told him reverence meant keeping mysteries intact, not turning them into devices. Yet he had watched doctrines harden into rules that sometimes felt like walls. He thought of Martha's slow retreat from laughter to silence, and how, during that time, many pious words had been offered that did not ease the nights. He thought of the neighbor Harold, who counters his gloom with the blunt stick of humor, and how small acts, making coffee, fixing a broken latch, sometimes felt like the truest pastoral care. The being's language shifted. It moved from diagnosis to pedagogy. It promised to show, not merely tell. It did so in a way that, in Joseph's telling, always feels like the hinge of the whole experience. Rather than reading about Jesus' actions, Joseph would be made to feel the field Jesus moved through. The being did not claim to rewrite scripture in Joseph's ears. It promised a sensory reenactment within his consciousness, a careful, respectful visualization that allowed Joseph to understand the how rather than dispute the who. The being said in Joseph's mind, "You will see an unfolding. You will feel what it is to be within a field that dissolves the edges of fear. You will not be required to accept my taxonomy, only to recognize the effect." What followed was less like a movie and more like a seam unzipping reality. The porch and the wind and the smell of the kettle did not so much vanish as fold inward, as if Joseph's world shrank into a smaller, more focused lens. He felt himself move without moving, like sliding into a pool and discovering it deeper than it looked from the edge. In that shift, memory came forward as a tool. Joseph found himself on a street he had never walked, and yet could recognize with the same odd intimacy he felt toward Martha's handwriting. It was a narrow lane. The air tasted of dust and roasted barley. A man stood there, familiar enough to be unmistakable, dignified enough to be undeniable. He wore no armor. His clothing was simple. His eyes were steady. Around him, the crowd did not part as if by magic, but their fear seemed to be receding like a tide. People leaned closer. A woman with an injured shoulder looked at him as if hope had been handed back to her. A child stopped crying. In Joseph's mind, the being narrated like a patient teacher. It did not give play-by-play. It simplified. It said in Joseph's mind, "Observe how his presence alters the space, not by command, but by being centered." That centering is what many named miracle. Joseph watched without thinking of the names he had been taught, without arranging scenes into doctrinal compartments. He felt rather than analyzed. A warmth that was not the sun, but something like it, steady, not scorching. An attention that did not demand, but acknowledged in a way that altered the one acknowledged. The woman with the shoulder straightened, not because an invisible hand had snapped her bones into place, but because the realization that she would not be alone to suffer had taken root. Joseph felt grief soften under such a presence. It did not vanish. It rearranged itself into a different shape. This was the being's core pedagogy in condensed form, that Jesus' acts, healing, reconciling, transfiguring, were demonstrations of what happens when a human collapses the distance between the heart and the rest of the organism, when love is not merely felt, but sustained as a field.
Yet even as Joseph absorbed the sight, the being warned him that the story of such actions had been bent by time. It framed the bending not purely as malice, but as consequence, social complexity producing simplification. The being said in Joseph's mind, "Remember that human institutions are built to preserve. Preservation often selects for stability over dynamism. What is reproducible on a mass scale becomes law. What requires daily intimate fidelity becomes lore. In that sorting, the technique was smoothed into creed, and people learned to recite rather than to do." To Joseph, this seemed both plausible and tragic. He had seen reverent ritual, ordination, and pews, and he had seen communion serve as both balm and barrier. The being's tone was compassionate toward institutions. It did not vilify a history full of real human longing and fear. Rather, it suggested that institutionalization was one of several forces that placed distance between ordinary people and the active, reproducible power at the heart of the early demonstrations. He thought of Martha again, how she once tied a bandana around Joseph's head when he strained his back hauling bales, and how that small care did more for him than any sermon. He thought of how love in practice had always been more medicinal to him than doctrine. The vision threaded these small truths to the larger claim that demonstration of an accessible state was always a social practice as much as it was a spiritual one. Joseph asked the kind of question a man both practical and desperate asks. If such a thing could be cultivated, how would one begin?
He had not expected the being to give him a manual. He did not expect anything so utilitarian, but he wanted the comfort of steps, a map to follow so that longing did not simply swell and then die. The being said in Joseph's mind, "Begin with attention to the center. Breathe into the place that keeps your grief. Let it feel held. Let the memory that carries your love be the spark. Dissolve the habitual walls you build, fear, judgment, the belief that you are separate, and you will access a consistent heart state. The rest is practice." Even rendered in the being's concise words, the teaching landed as both tender and urgent. Joseph felt a heat in his chest, not pain this time, but activation, a small steadiness like a candle finding the wind's edge and deciding to persist. For a sliver of 3 heartbeats, he tasted a clarity he had not known since before Martha's diagnosis. The weight of grief drew away from the center of his chest and became something he could hold instead of something that held him. In those seconds, he saw Martha as she had been on a morning they had laughed about a stubborn calf. Her smile came to him without the ache that usually followed. The taste faded, as all things do. It left a residue like perfume, a memory of sweetness and an ache for more. Joseph found himself back on the porch, the mug still whole at his feet, though dew had crept over it. The light hovered, patient. The being did not press him to believe. It pressed him to remember the feeling. "You must understand," the being said in his mind, "that this is not proof for courts or for textbooks. It is proof for living. If you accept, you will become responsible for the practice." Responsibility felt like a heavy word and a balm. To be responsible for one's own opening was, for Joseph, preferable to being told there was nothing to do but wait. The being's next words introduced a caution that the path would not be painless. It would require facing the internal hard things that had calcified around his hurt. It spoke of 3 knotted resistances: fear, judgment, the sense of separation, and explained in lay terms the old rancher understood how they had worked like barbed wire around his heart. Pulling them out would hurt. The being said in Joseph's mind, "The first taste was to give you hope. The habit of opening is cultivated slowly. Tiny repetitions matter. You will not be reborn in an instant. You will be retrained." Joseph had an image then, unbidden, the old barn with a new hinge. It would not swing silently the first time. It would creak and demand oil. He could do the work. He had made a living by doing small, stubborn things every day. That thought steadied him. When the being finally explained why the method had vanished from common life, it framed it as both human short-sightedness and practical necessity. People had to build systems to carry knowledge when oral transmission failed. Those systems solidified in ways that made the technique rarer.
But the being also suggested another reason, one that felt more like strategy than accident. When a practice empowers people to touch what had previously been the remit of priests and prophets, social tensions arise. Structures prefer the knowable and the legislated. The being said in Joseph's mind, there were times of consolidation when the living practice was taught only in hushed circles because regimes feared destabilization. Over centuries, the taught became the taught about, and demonstration faded. Joseph, who had lived long enough to see both kindness and cruelty passed down like heirloom tools, felt the complexity of that hesitant history. He did not accept the being's narrative as an indictment. Instead, he absorbed it as a picture of human behavior, like weather more than malice, where fear of chaos sometimes outweighed willingness to teach flames to not burn. He asked, with a humility that was not theatrical, whether the being wanted anything from him. He had expected a demand, perhaps a doctrinal conversion or a pledge. He had expected a test. The being surprised him by offering a simple, almost domestic task to practice the taste it had given and to notice what shifted, to report back in the way sober people report on any experiment, with observation, not persuasion. The being said in Joseph's mind, "Test it in your life. Notice the small changes. If you find it meaningful, share with others who will do the work with you. If you do not, keep what you learned and let it pass." The permission to test and the quiet blessing to decline felt like the clearest sign that this was not coercion. Joseph carried a stubborn, skeptical brain that needed to corroborate and a tender, worn heart that wanted to be held. The invitation allowed both. He slept in the hours after, in a sleep that was not empty but threaded with dream sensation, Martha near, not as a speechless apparition, but as an impression of hands and the smell of laundry soap. When dawn bled into the field, the light in the east thin and tentative, Joseph rose with the residue of the visitation heavy and luminous in the same breath. He walked the fence line, checking the posts as he always did, and for a moment the world felt slightly altered. The hens were nearer to the coop than usual. Harold's radio came faint across the neighbor's acreage, playing an old country tune that made him think of Martha tapping a spoon on a pan. That week he did what the being had asked, if only in the minimal way he could manage. He sat for a few minutes on the kitchen stool, breathing slow and less asleep than usual. He touched the place where the taste had lived at his sternum. He did not expect fireworks. He expected only to measure the ordinary. Did he sleep differently? Was his back less taut? Did the ache in his jaw ease?
He noted small things like a ledger. Sleeplessness softened 2 nights out of 7. His appetite returned a smidge. The neighbor Harold stopped by with a jar of jam and lingered longer than politeness required. Word did not spread in the way a sensational story might. Joseph was not the kind to call the paper, and he had no social media following. What shifted were the small ripples a single heart causes when it is altered, the way a man moves through a room, the volume of his laughter, the patience with which he waits. Animals, in Joseph's account, were often the first to notice. One afternoon, a stray dog that had always kept a cautious distance from the farmhouse trotted up and rested its head on Joseph's boot in a way that made him imagine Martha's chin pressed to his shoulder. He did not announce the moment as proof. He jotted it on the margin of a grocery list and kept it for himself. Still, the being's last words before it lifted with the light that morning thinned the private to a larger horizon. There was, it suggested, a threshold of collective tuning. Individuals opening their centers mattered in themselves. Multiplied, they acted like an amplifier. The phrasing felt both grand and personal, global stakes dressed in neighborly terms. The being said in Joseph's mind, a few thousand practiced activations tending to this frequency can change strain on a larger system. Imagine a field of wheat. One stalk bending invites the stalk beside it to follow. Coordinate the bending, and the harvest changes. Joseph listened, felt somehow both smaller and less alone. The image of wheat bending was simple and agricultural, and therefore sensible to him. He could imagine a field changing when enough stalks turned the same way. The language did not promise salvation. The being framed it as mitigation of a decline, a possibility rather than prophecy. Over the next weeks, Joseph's nights threaded with small experiments. He kept a journal he labeled with Martha's name because the book's margin made him feel less ridiculous. He would not have expected such tenderness, and he guarded it like a seed. He noted sleep quality, pain levels subjectively rated by himself, and memories that warmed without sinking. He took walks and noticed fewer of the old aches. He did not share the full story. He would not claim miracles. He allowed only for the language of change and observation. And yet the visitation had left him changed in ways more than catalogable. There was a rest in him he had not negotiated at his age, an acceptance that his life might yet hold unknown instruction. The being had given him a method to try, a warning that the method required elbow grease, and a gentle explanation that history had not been malicious so much as forgetful and defensive. That combination, teaching without coercion, diagnosis without condemnation, kept his heart open enough to try. One night, 3 weeks after the first light, the sky was the color of bruised denim, and the house smelled of stew. Joseph settled into his chair with the journal and turned to the page he had marked the first night. The taste, the being, the words about wheat. He set a timer on his old stove, not to measure, but to keep him honest.
And he followed the being's simplest instruction, to breathe with attention toward the center. He did not imagine that breath as magic. He imagined it as a patient work of turning toward what had been held away. As he breathed, the story returned, the narrow lane, the man, the warmth, and then something more immediate, a clear sense that he was not alone. Martha's presence, when it came, was not a voice pronouncing doctrine or a promise of resurrection. It was small, the memory of how she used to say his name when calling him in from the field. He closed his eyes and let that memory occupy the space the being had called the center. The ache that had been a fist behind his breast softened into the shape of a hand he could hold. It is important to say here, in the same breath as any storyteller owes honesty, that what Joseph experienced remained his own interior testimony. The being's claims about history and technique were offered, and he had tasted a state. He had not raised anyone from the dead. He had not performed miracles in public. He had, however, begun a sequence of small recoveries, sleep that returned in patches, a pain that eased enough to let him bend and tie up hay without the old grunting pause, a neighbor's knock that came more often, conversations that lasted longer and felt less brittle. In the weeks that followed, a curious thing happened that he had not anticipated. Telling the story, when he did not create a crowd, but an effect. He told the tale to Harold over a cup of coffee and to Mrs. Abernathy at the feed store, two people who had known both him and Martha. They listened. They did not scoff. They asked practical questions about how one might practice the breath and what it felt like. Harold, whose instinct was always to make a joke of pain, asked about the tools rather than the revelation. "How long you been doing it?" he said. Joseph shrugged. He used the word taste. "And did it feel like cheating?" Mrs. Abernathy asked, more serious. She had lost a sister to something called sudden decline and wore grief like a sensible hat. "No," Joseph said. "It felt like learning to stand again after you've been down for a while. Awkward and honest." That phrase, awkward and honest, might be the truest summary of the way the feeling spread. No one demanded doctrine. No one asked for miracles. People asked for practice. The being had offered a demonstration and an instruction, and the rest, if there was a rest, would be a process. The sky over the field had been generous that month.
On some mornings, the light made the long grass appear gilded. On others, the fog thickened like a soup pot that had been forgotten on a stove. Joseph walked the fence and breathed with intention. He journaled small improvements as if they were payments towards something he did not yet fully understand. He resisted the temptation to cloud his notes with language that promised more than he felt comfortable asserting. He wrote, "Slept better. Pain lessened. Felt Martha's laugh in a dream and woke with a smile." Inside him, the being's claim about history kept coming back. It was one thing to feel held. It was another to contend with the weight of centuries that had shaped people's access to such practices. He respected the complexity. He could imagine councils, debates, practical needs for order. He could also imagine, and here the being's tone sharpened in his memory, the moments when an experience is locked away because it unsettles those with invested power. Yet there was another edge to the story the being told, an urgency that was not theatrical but sober. The world, it suggested, was encountering pressures that made the practice not only a private consolation, but a necessary stabilizer. The being did not prophesy doom. It offered a risk assessment dressed in agricultural metaphor. The being said in Joseph's mind, "Systems that rely on the maintenance of separation are under strain. Practices that reduce separation do not merely comfort, they redistribute stress. There is a threshold, unknown in measure, where enough small shifts lessen the load." It was a statement that could be read as alarmist or as pragmatic. Joseph read it as an invitation to pay attention. He felt the stakes for what they were, not salvation theater, and not guaranteed avoidance of trouble, but a nudge toward a collective choosing of different habits. How one build toward such a thing, by repetition, by humility, by soft rather than blunt leadership, was the question that would soon demand more than a few breaths on a porch. And so, with the light that had first named the possibility now gone, though its seed remained, Joseph kept breathing. He kept noting. He kept opening. The porch, which had been the scene of a private visitation, became the place where he practiced the smallest acts of being human again. He did not rush to become a teacher. He did not seek followers.
He practiced because it was the work offered to him, and because he had a sense that the taste he had been given was not for hoarding. One night, months later, something shifted again. The sky above the meadow was particular. Stars looked closer, as if someone had slid them 2 beats nearer. Joseph sat on the porch, the journal open on his knee like a companion. He had felt changes, yes, but he also felt the stubborn knots the being had named, flashes of fear, a reflective critique when he first noticed pride creeping in, and the recurring sense of separateness that once felt like a home.
He had practiced dissolving them in small increments, but there are times when practice asks for an escalation. The light came back with the same gentleness and more insistence. The being's presence filled the porch as if the space had been set to the frequency it preferred. Joseph did not flinch. He had been waiting for confirmation and for instruction. He wanted to see more than the taste. He wanted to walk the lane he had been shown earlier with less the haze of dream and more the clarity of being present. He wanted to know what the being would teach next, and, in a way that surprised him, he wanted to know how history had been altered with such finality that the living technique had narrowed. The being said in Joseph's mind, "Tonight I will take you someplace you will remember as if you had lived it. Watch and feel, and keep your taxonomies gentle." Joseph felt the old seam open again. The world folded, and the porch became a threshold. He exhaled, aware that the moment would not be a conclusion, but an invitation to a longer path. The light moved, and with it the sense of being ready to be shown more, an inner map unfurling that promised to include both tenderness for the past and an account of why much of what was once common practice had retreated. He leaned forward, as if in a stall at a church fair where the fortune-teller had the answer he needed. Beyond that hinge, the being prepared to trace the scenes that would show Jesus in his own field, not as an aloof miracle worker, but as a center of a living practice. Joseph felt the pull toward that vision and heard, in the being's voice, an echo of urgency. Not every tradition had kept the practice. Not every heart would choose to open. The light held, waiting for him to step in. The seam opened, and Joseph was inside the scene before he could tell himself it was a dream. This time the lane he had visited before tightened into sharper color, the dust smelling of time and something like fresh bread. The crowd was closer, breathing as one thing, faces turned not with awe but with a kind of quiet expectation. The man at the center, the being's vision of a teacher, stood and simply waited. His presence felt as if someone had turned up a lamp in a dark room. There was no sudden blaze, only a steady illumination that let details settle into place. In Joseph's sense, the teacher moved without hurry. People did not flee from him or press upon him. They leaned in the way people lean toward the hearth when cold. A woman with a limp approached, and before anyone spoke, she laid a hand on the teacher's sleeve. The posture was not theatrical. It was a human reaching for another human who did not recoil from the touch of need. A man with an angry face found himself lowering his tone. A child, who minutes before had been wailing, opened his mouth and then found it quiet. Joseph felt these changes in his own chest, like the soft rearrangement of furniture in a familiar room.
The being's voice threaded through the vision with the same patient clarity as before. The being said in Joseph's mind, "Watch how presence shifts everything, not by forceful will, but by coherence. The teacher's center is a place of sustained attention. That attention is the field I spoke of. It is not magic in the sense of breaking natural law. It is a recalibration of what a human system can do when freed from the constant drag of fear." Joseph watched a woman with swollen hands stand, and then slowly, as if remembering how to use fingers forgotten to stiffness, pick up a basket and move it to her hip. He watched a man who had been bent by labor stand taller and reach to hug the child he had been avoiding. These were intimate reversals, not theatrical resurrections. They read to Joseph as realignment, an organism finding a more functional pattern when it was allowed to breathe differently. The being said in Joseph's mind, "Think of it like a choir. When one singer finds pitch, the closest voices follow. When a human organizes themselves around a coherent center, local systems, blood pressure, nervous tone, attention, tend to follow. This coherence affects others who are close enough to be entrained by it." Joseph felt reverence in the vision. He felt also the humiliation of his own prior assumptions.
He had always imagined grand gestures required to rewrite what a body held. Here, in the scene, what changed were the small articulations of being human: attention, steadiness, a refusal to be enlisted by panic. The being did not say Jesus was less. It said that the mode of his action was different from the ledger Joseph had been taught. It was demonstration more than unmerited exception. As the vision breathed itself to a close, the being guided Joseph back toward a compressed history. The scenes shifted like pages: early gatherings where followers met in kitchens to practice a way of being, roadside instructions where a teacher sat with a handful of workers and showed them how to breathe with attention, communities where the practice entered daily chores as posture and prayer. These sequences were not intended as documentary. They were a pedagogical map in Joseph's experience, an inner compression of what might have been spread across generations. The being said in Joseph's mind, "For a time the practice was common. It was the work of households and small groups. Over time, as populations grew and governance demanded standardization, the living technique was folded into liturgy and creeds. What had been taught at the bedside and at the plow became something you read about more than practiced." Joseph felt the weight of centuries as if they were coats hung on a peg. The being did not condemn. It narrated dynamics. Complexity favored systems that could scale. Oral practice, which depends on attention and repeated relational transmission, is harder to scale than words on a page.
And when power consolidates, the body's habit of instruction, teaching someone how to settle the nervous system with their breath or how to disarm a reflexive judgment, becomes a liability for administrators who rely on predictable forms of control. The being said in Joseph's mind, "Institutions do what institutions must to persist. They simplify, they standardize. The living art became something to be safeguarded, and guarded things grow quiet. Practices that require individual activation invite unpredictability. Structures seek stability." Joseph listened without anger. He saw how, in the arc the being described, the impulse to preserve goodness sometimes produced a narrowing. He thought of the liturgy he had known as a younger man, of its power to hold a community's memory. He also thought of the nights when his own needs had been met by a neighbor with a hot bowl of stew, rather than by the formulae he had memorized. Both were real. Both had place. The being's narration offered neither a triumphal insult nor a simplistic romance of a lost golden age. It simply framed a trade-off and a loss. Then the instruction deepened. The being said in Joseph's mind, "Practice is simple in outline, demanding in detail. Begin at the center. Breathe through the heart. Evoke a memory of warmth. Name and invite the resistances: fear, judgment, separation. Bring attention to each. Breathe them with kindness. Repeat. 10 minutes, 20 minutes for sustained work. Practice daily." Joseph's mind took notes by habit. He wanted specifics, a map he could trust with the same steadiness he trusted a weathered tractor. The being obliged. Its language was, as before, careful to avoid imperial claims. It framed particulars as tools, not guarantees. The being said in Joseph's mind, "The basic protocol is as follows. Sit or stand comfortably. Soften the shoulders. Place your attention at the center of your chest, the place where sorrow sits and where love forms. Inhale for a count that feels steady, 5 beats. Breathe the air toward that center, as if you were sending water to a dry root. Exhale for a like count, 5 beats, letting the breath return past the heart and out. Repeat this cycle with gentle patience for 20 minutes. If 20 feels like too much at first, begin with 5 and build. The practice can be 2 10-minute sessions or 1 20-minute session. It is less about a checklist and more about attention repeated." He added in Joseph's memory 3 active moves. The being said in Joseph's mind, "First, evoke a memory that carries warmth, a small scene of tenderness. Let it be specific. A laugh, a hand on a shoulder, the tilt of someone's head. Allow the sensation to occupy the heart space while you breathe. Second, name the resistance you feel, fear, judgment, or the sense of being separate. Do not argue with it. Invite it to be witnessed. Breathe toward it. Third, employ a dissolution phrase, something honest and short. I see you, you are not my master."
Or, if that feels stern, simply be held. Repeat until the resistance softens. When strong emotions arise, grief, anger, stay with them if you can, or seek supportive presence. This is work that can open old wounds. It may be wise to proceed with care. Joseph felt the instructions as if someone had handed him a hoe and explained how to plant. They were earthy, utilitarian, and strangely intimate.
The breathing pattern, 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out, felt doable on the porch, while waiting for the stove to boil, while sitting beside the barn at dusk. The evocation of memory felt permission rather than therapy. The dissolution phrases felt like salves you might whisper into a cut. The being's explanation leaned for a moment into a speculative description of mechanism, phrased as suggestion rather than proof. The being said in Joseph's mind, "When a human settles into a coherent heart state, there is a patterned alignment in physiology, calmer breathing, more regulated autonomic tone, more coherent neural signals, what some scientists in your era have called coherence. This coherence tends to radiate slightly beyond the skin. It is small, it is local, it is enough." Joseph heard the caveat in the tone. The being did not claim laboratory certainty. It framed the language as a bridge between the inner feeling and the outer observation, words that help align a person to a practice that produces perceivable, repeatable shifts. Joseph's rancher common sense liked the image. Something that produces small regular changes is worth doing. The being added a cautionary map for emotional risks. The being said in Joseph's mind, "The path is not a guaranteed fix. Some trauma requires companionship with trained clinicians. If feelings overwhelm you, seek help. Use the practice as part of a wider care plan. I do not replace doctors or counselors. I offer a way to expand what you can hold." Joseph felt steadied by that sanity. He liked not being promised miracles, liked the lack of theatrical absolutes. He liked the idea that practice was reliable in the way that a well-kept fence is reliable. It requires maintenance. After the teaching, the being offered another experience. In Joseph's memory, the light narrowed, and he was given a longer window, a minute, perhaps two, inside the field the being had described. It was as if someone had turned a radio knob and let him sit in a song for a while. In that time, Joseph felt his breath slow without forcing, and a spaciousness expand behind his sternum. The world did not rearrange itself into miracle theater. Rather, his habitual urgency thinned enough that he could notice small mercies. The memory of Martha landed like a hand placed gently on his shoulder and stayed. When he returned from that state, the light was withdrawing. The being said in Joseph's mind, "You have tasted a different pattern. Practice until the pattern is yours. Observe, report what changes."
If you agree, find 2 or 3 others and practice with them. That is how a field grows, by linked centers. Joseph took those instructions like a pledge written on a scrap of paper. He did not set out to start a movement. He set out to be faithful to the work offered to him. He began to practice more regularly, not with zealotry, but with a kind of disciplined curiosity. He tracked nights of sleep, the way his back eased, how often his jaw unclenched during the day. He wrote small objective notes, 2 items that would satisfy a practical man. Nights slept better, pain eased enough to lift hay without a pause, and subjective notes, felt Martha's laugh twice, neighbor lingered longer. Weeks passed and the ledger grew with modest dignity. He did not wake to grand cures. He woke to a life that had more room in it, a longer endurance for grief, less reflexive irritation when Harold arrived with jokes clipped like fence posts, a patient hand when the hens fought in the coop. Mrs. Abernathy, who had always been careful with her questions and her grief, tried the breath for 2 weeks and sent him a pie. She said the breath made her feel less like she was carrying the world solo. Harold, who had been more muscle than meditation, grunted one morning and then quietly asked about the timing. He did not come for meaning, he came for tools. That was the kind Joseph wanted, neighbors learning to hold one another a little less roughly. Animals continued to be early responders. A stray that had once kept its distance now settled its head against Joseph's porch step. A mare that had been skittish when Joseph walked past the fence now lowered her head to be brushed. These changes Joseph recorded as gentle observation. He knew anecdotes do not equal proof. He also knew how small shifts altered the tenor of a life. As his practice deepened, Joseph experienced what the being had warned about. Old resistances surfaced to be seen. Fear flared at the thought that practicing would mean losing control. Judgment whispered that the practice was foolish. The sense of separation returned in the form of old isolation. The method the being taught turned these resistances into the work itself. When fear rose, name it and breathe into it. When judgment hardened, invite curiosity. When separation tightened, seek connection with another practicing person. Joseph formed a small circle, not a congregation, but a handful of neighbors and friends who wanted to try the practice with him. They met on Saturday mornings at the feed store before business opened. They sat on crates and practiced the breathing protocol together. 5 counts in, 5 counts out. Memory evocation, soft phrases to dissolve resistance. They compared notes like farmers comparing seeds. What time of day yielded the best sleep? Which memory brought the warmest sonority? It was clumsy and tender, and, importantly to Joseph, ordinary. The being had framed a larger structural warning in his vision. It had used agricultural images because Joseph responded to them. A few hands tending a field can change the crop. In one of the being's last transmissions, it leaned into the metaphor again. The being said in Joseph's mind,
Imagine hundreds, then thousands of centers practicing. The local field of coherence expands. It affects the way people hold stress. It changes the thresholds of reactivity. It does not make trouble disappear. It tilts the system toward resilience rather than brittle collapse. That matter is practical. It belongs to daily choices rather than single spectacles. Joseph felt the weight and the humility of that possibility. He understood that he had no power to save nations or avert every hardship. What he could do, what he had been asked to do, was tend his own center and invite others to learn. The moral question for him was not how to convince the world, but how to be faithful in his small plot. Months of practice accumulated like good compost. He noticed his sleep deepen more nights than not. The pain that had once taxed his mornings receded enough for him to bend with less cursing. He dreamed of Martha in ways that left him comforted rather than shattered. A hand at his shoulder, a recipe corrected, a laugh at a private joke. These experiences he recorded with the restraint of a man who had learned to keep tender things private. He shared enough with Harold and Mrs. Abernathy that they began to practice too. Their lives altered in ways proportionate to their engagement. A softer word exchanged at the fence, a longer sit by the radio between coffees. Joseph also felt unease at times. Human hearts are not instruments to be tuned entirely by oneself. Pride crept into his notes every now and again, an itch he had to name and breathe into. He found himself repelling a neighbor's question and then apologizing. The practice taught him humility by revealing how easy it is to mistake a habit for a virtue. At a quiet point in autumn, when the corn was down and the air had a thin edge, the being returned one last time, in the particular way that mattered to Joseph, not to give him answers, but to deepen his commission. The light wore the same geometry, but carried a new insistence. The being said in Joseph's mind, "The work is not done for any single life. You will not be measured by spectacle, but by patience. Teach the method without coercion. Admit the limits. Encourage the small gatherings. Watch for those ready to learn, and be ready to sit with those in deeper pain and point them to professional help." Joseph asked aloud, as he had before, whether the being wanted anything more than his practice and quiet testimony. The being said in Joseph's mind, "Be faithful. Keep your hands outstretched in practical ways. Mend a fence, bring a stew, hold a hand." The practice is not meant to be divorced from ordinary care. It is not an escape from grief, but a way to carry it so that it does not calcify.
He returned to his life with a steadying sense of purpose. He mended the barn hinge, and it creaked less. He sat with Harold and swapped tools. He called Mrs. Abernathy on a bad morning and listened without trying to fix. The practice, when combined with these small acts, began to feel integrated into the fabric of his days. Word of the practice did not become a headline. It spread like seed blown on a modest wind. A neighbor who tried it, a friend who found it eased sleeplessness, a couple who used the breath to sit together without arguing over the small humiliations of living. The field grew slowly, and the people who came were practical. They wanted to understand how to live with less reactive fear and more steady care. The being's earlier claim about history, why the technique had been folded into doctrine, and why living practice had retreated, stayed with Joseph as an interpretive frame rather than a polemic. He found it useful when people asked him about religious institutions. He answered with caution and generosity. History is complex. Many who have cared for souls have done so from love. Systems have protective tendencies. He invited curiosity, not complaint. When strangers came asking for certainty, evidence of miraculous power or quick fixes, Joseph told them what he knew modestly, that practice produced small, reliable changes for some, that deeper trauma needs companion care, that he had tasted a state which he could grow into but never claim proprietorship over. He had no charter to change doctrine. He had only an invitation to practice. One spring, months into his steady work, an extraordinary moment occurred that illuminated the subtlety of change. A boy from town who had once been rude to every elder he met showed up at the feed store and offered to help stack wood without being asked. Harold raised an eyebrow and asked why. The boy shrugged and said, "Feels easier to be with people." They did not speak about frequency or fields. They stacked wood and spent the rest of the morning carrying small loads and talking about slow things. Joseph did not call that proof of the being's claim. He called it evidence of habit change. A handful of others, hearing Joseph's measured account, began to practice privately. Some felt shifts within weeks, others took months to report a single bright moment and then a slower unfolding. A woman in town wrote to Joseph that after 2 months she finally slept without waking at 3 a.m. She thanked him and added a line he treasured.
It is not that the world is safer, Joseph. It is that I can meet it with less violence in my chest. These accounts were not uniform. Some tried and felt nothing. Some felt frightening emotion they later handled with the help of counselors. Joseph encouraged everyone to regard the work as personal inquiry, and when necessary, to combine it with professional care.
The larger possibility the being had named, that a critical mass of centers practicing could shift collective thresholds, remains speculative in Joseph's view and in the story's frame. He wondered what thousands of people practicing daily would do. Would it create less reactivity in neighborhoods? Would it alter how communities respond to crisis? He imagined a field of neighbors who could hold one another's grief without militarizing it into fear. He did not imagine a miraculous erasure of difficulty. He imagined a different distribution of stress. Joseph kept the metaphor of the wheat field in mind. He thought of neighbors as adjacent stalks. When one bends, the neighbor notes it. When many bend in a cooperative way, the landscape changes. That image guided how he taught. Small groups, consistent practice, attention to humility, insistence that the work is not a private occult, but a daily discipline integrated with ordinary kindness. In the quiet conclusion of his story, Joseph did not become a prophet with a following. He became a neighbor who had learned a technique that eased his life and who was gentle enough to share it without insisting it was the only way. He mended fences, made sure the hens had water, and practiced on his porch each morning when the air had the particular clarity that made everything look possible in soft light. He did not preach doctrine or denounce institutions. He confessed only what he had tasted and how he continued to live. If the tale leaves you with a mixture of wonder and skepticism, that is as it should be. This is Joseph's testimony, a narrative shaped by grief and a taste of a pattern he learned to cultivate. It is framed by an encounter with a being whose words Joseph received and whose explanations he considers as suggestion rather than definitive history. If you are curious, the practice is simple enough to try and gentle enough to abandon if it does not help. If you want support in learning the method in a fuller, guided format, there is a practical guide that outlines the breathing cycles, memory evocation prompts, and dissolution steps in more detail. You can find a link to that ebook in the pinned comment below. If you're considering working more closely with someone to integrate this practice into your life, especially if you carry deep trauma, there is information in the video description about private sessions and referrals to professional resources. Please remember, these are spiritual experiential methods and are not substitutes for medical or psychiatric care. Joseph's life stayed ordinary and yet more tender. On some evenings he would sit with his journal and write down small changes as if accounting for gifts he did not want to squander. He would look up at the Montana sky and sometimes, in the dim between stars, think of the being's geometry of light and the teacher's steady presence in the lane.
He kept practicing because the practice gave him something practical to do with his grief. It taught him to breathe into the place where loss lived and to let it soften enough to be carried. The confession the being had made that what Jesus actually did might be understood as a sustained human center of love more than a set of isolated miracles remained in Joseph's life an invitation rather than an indictment. The history it described was, for him, a cautionary tale about how institutions organize learning and how living practice can slip into memory. The work that followed was small and stubborn. Breathe, evoke, name, soften, and repeat. The rewards were not billboards or signs, but steadier sleep, easier bones, animals that trusted him more quickly, neighbors who sat longer at table, and a tenderness toward Martha that was less jagged. If Joseph's story speaks to you, try the practice for yourself with temperate expectation. Start with 5 minutes a day and build to 20. Keep a simple journal. Days slept better, days with less sharp pain, notes on relationships that shift. If strong emotions surface, seek help from a counselor or trusted friend. If the practice is helpful, share it with one other person and practice together. If it is not, let it go without shame. For those who want the step-by-step protocol and supportive materials, the ebook linked in the pinned comment includes the breathing cycle, guided prompts for memory evocation, suggested phrases for dissolving fear and judgment, and a modest workbook for tracking progress. If you're interested in personalized guidance, there are details in the description about private sessions, offered with clear boundaries and referrals when emotional support beyond spiritual practice is needed. Joseph never sought to overturn history or to claim absolute answers. He sought the small loyalty to a practice that had helped him carry what he could not bear alone.
He learned that spiritual power, if such a phrase comforts you, is not always a thunderbolt from an external sky, but often a patient retraining of how we hold our own hearts. In the end, his life was not a spectacle, but a steady tending, breathing on the porch, mending fences, offering a cup of coffee, and sometimes when the light came down, feeling a remembering that made the edges of sorrow softer. You may find this story odd, comforting, troubling, or a combination of all three. Hold what helps and set the rest down. If you try the practice, be gentle with yourself, keep company with trustworthy people, and treat this method as part of a broader life of care. The being's confession, delivered one slow Montana night to a worn farmer who loved his wife and his land, was not a demand for belief. It was an invitation to practice, to test, and to choose whether to tend a small center in a world that often expects us to hold everything alone.
If you would like the practical guide referenced in Joseph's story, you'll find the link to download the ebook in the pinned comment below. Details about private sessions and professional referrals are in the description. Whether you pick up the practice or not, may you find a way to carry your grief with less sharpness and more room for the people and small acts that make life bearable.